And good evening. It's November 26th, 2024, and we're continuing our discussion collection in the Outside the Class series from the Bible Project. Covers the entire TaNaK, right? The entire Old Testament. But on TheDustyFeet.com, in that Outside the Class section, all of those source videos are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. And the lectures would all be found in that source video playlist. Because we try to keep these to about 15 minutes. We want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest. Scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before you forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button, please. But those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, right? The entire Old Testament. But we're going to do it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So as we get past the first 5, it could get interesting. But remember, these videos that we're going to talk about, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Deuteronomy, Devarim. This is our part 1. So this is a scroll that needs those 3 preceding scrolls in order to really grasp the story, right? This is going to recap us a bit, but it's far from the inclusive fullness of the previous. Although it does logically flow a bit from Numbers, we just get a bit more. So let's recap a bit, right? We ended Numbers with the children of Israel on the cusp of entering the Promised Land, right? God appointed Joshua to be the successor for Moses for the people. For him, he was now their shepherd. And Jericho, right across the river in their sight. Now, 2 tribes, Reuben and Gad, they wanted to settle on this side of the Jordan, which is beautiful, fertile land for their livestock. Moses, they take it to him. He thinks about it. He acquiesces, stipulating that their men will still help the rest of the tribes push the rest of the folks on the other side out that are no longer welcome. You know, we ended with the recount of their journey, right? We had a census, a discussion of territorial boundaries, the appointment and the names of the leaders, because this is a new generation. This is entirely post-Sinai people, right? And it's interesting because here is where we get this talk of cities, right? Cities are supposed to be set aside for the Levites, right? Because this priestly tribe is appointed by God. They have no individual inheritance. Those tribal leaders that were to hand out inheritance, the Levites were not part of that. But God instructs them to set aside cities for these guys. And the land around those cities, well, that was for their pastures, for their beasts. They're given 48 cities, 42 to live in and 6 to manage, right? These are those refuge cities. So for our headspace purposes, we have roughly 4 cities per tribal land, including a refuge city for every 2 tribes. We really don't have time to dig into it here, right? But there are many questions about those refuge sites and how they were managed. But that's probably for a different coffee and donuts discussion, yeah? We have feast days, offerings, vows. Yes, I have to say it. I'm not sure why the death of Messiah would render now unimportant all of those. So, yep, Probably another coffee donuts chat for another time. But this scroll seems to take a step back. So if this were a story being read, maybe you'd ask, why the step backwards? I would say, good question. For this reminds me of the beginning of Genesis and the words that we have with the creation story in chapter 1, and then the creation story again in chapter 2, and yet they're slightly different. Because I think it makes you think about it a bit, right? Including the whys, the wherefores. And I think sometimes you need to ask those questions. I think it's fair here. So the difference is for sure we have context here, because what we do have is a backwards look and a bit of forward thinking. And that makes me wonder sometimes when we have in our time, we have our founding fathers, yeah? Okay, I don't know if about the development of our legal history, and some people probably do know, and you're welcome to comment, educate me on it. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. But my questions here are about where we go from when the Constitution is first written. Because let's be truthful, the Constitution only covers some essential things that must be addressed still in the communal society. They were especially aware that this group that had different states, colonies at the time, that there would need to be differences depending on where you were, who the people were, the makeup, all kinds of things. But even then, when you start to look and go back, how far along would we go, maybe where we needed to stop, to rethink, maybe to add something, or ensure that what might be implied there might need to be addressed differently later on, yeah? Because we just had a little bit of that intriguing example of the group of sisters, right? Their inheritance was laid out, which is how the land was supposed to be laid out by the tribal leaders for their respective tribes. But based on that, these family sisters, they'd have lost out. Because let's remember that something is said initially, and then we get to the point, what about us? In this situation, so be aware that these things happen, and I think it's essential for us to address these issues again as we see them and as they're needed, right? Numbers 27, I think it's verse 3. So our father died in the wilderness, yet he was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but he died in his own sin, and he had no sons. So these daughters, they bring Moses, I think, a very mature discussion. Dad was not part of the Korah rebellion, yet his choices were still his own, but he had no sons. So I think there needs to be a way to address this. Instruction amended, right ruling prevails. So in our forward-living context story, right, we have real people living real lives. They're in the desert, living daily on God's sustenance. We have this set of instructions. And we have events that raised questions that then needed to be discussed. That's what I'm talking about. In the beginning, the Constitution's laid out. Then life goes, plays out. We had answers to some questions, but I think more questions arise. We get Moses looking back and talking about what was told at Sinai. Remember, it is Sinai back, but yet we're going to have something different than we had before. Because remember, we have a different group here. Because I think we often don't stop to realize that this group is different in many ways. I guess I've overused the word really, and I overuse it differently, but they are different. Really. I mean, what we have here is a group of people that were anywhere from 19 down to the womb, right? I know we saw people there that weren't even in the womb, but when he's addressing it here, he's talking about those at Sinai. So, okay, we have a context because we know everybody from age 20 and on, all of those who were there, they're now all gone. Because these are the children that have grown up hearing their parents say, they will or we will. They've agreed to follow the covenant, live the lives that their parents have said, yes, we're going to do this. But then en masse, again, not 100%, but still, they chose not to follow those meanings, right? They wanted to grumble, to complain. They wanted to question God. Because I think it's an interesting question that I want to talk about here. So, because I think it's a good start. I think we're getting kicked off and we're going to talk about these guidelines, these instructions that what we have come to call laws that are given to these people. And I think we're at a point where I ask the question, because with them, there's much complaining and grumbling, and many people chose not to listen. But then I ask, because I'm with some of them, right? They never had the opportunity to exercise, to live out everything that was in Torah, that was promised in Torah. For instance, in the instructions, we address a guy who lives in a house with a flat roof. He doesn't put a railing around the edge to prevent people from falling off. That's an instruction. But they're not there to practice it. They can't even live it. They're in tents. Maybe, I don't know. I guess it's possible that somebody could have dug a hole that somebody's oxen fell in. But the purpose of that law, if you go back, that looks more to deal with somebody's livelihood, their future. So when you look back at these survivors of their parents, right, making those choices, doing those things, they haven't even had the opportunity to fully live these instructions, to reap all of the benefits of this set of wisdom instructions, these guidance laws that God gave to them. And yet we repeatedly say, I don't like these instructions even now. But it does ring a question for me that maybe it's a setup for the behavior that we have. Because again, I talk about it's us and them. So really it's a we, where we don't like that even a little bit. So we don't want any of it. So I think maybe this should really start to resonate with us. Because I think we get to this Genesis chapter 2 deja vu beginning here, right? Because the story we've just lived out in the previous 3 scrolls, and then Moses stops to bring it all up again. But I think there's a reason that we have new leaders and a new head count, because these folks had to be reminded of the story behind them and the vow that their forefathers had made. And were they up to the same commitment? So we have Moses start to recount the story, right? They leave Sinai. They have battles. They're on the cusp of the land and they balked. They just had 40 years. Then it hit me when I was reading this that I thought about the kind of innocence that the children were when they're hearing this, because they're now adults. I know we call them the children of Israel, and sometimes I think we mix it up because there are children in the group called the children of Israel, but it's made up of old people and young people. I think we just need to remember that term flows both ways, right? So these children, they're reminded of everything that happened before. So they, again, have no excuse. But some of them were unable to remember anything, right? Some were 19, right? And probably were at least semi-aware. Some could have been very aware because they saw all of that play out. Yet I think it's fair to say, let's be honest, in today's terms, they definitely could have been what we would be, traumatizing, PTSD, right? A lot is going on with these kids that they've been through as a result of their parents' choices or things that they saw, whether they understood them or not. I think because there's a good chance that some of those kids did not understand the choices, but their parents made it. But they did have to live out their parents' consequences. It's interesting when Moses is talking about the battles because it reminds them of their successes in these battles. They have battles that they've won. I think he encourages them, starting with these battles where God's been on their side. And he's saying, see? Because he's reminding them of the power of God and the success, things that they've seen. Because this is probably a strange thing to think about, because we only have the stories that we read in the scrolls, right? We weren't there. We try to imagine them, right? Directors like Cecil B. DeMille do the 10 Commandments, and they show us his vision of how the 10 plagues in Egypt played out. But it's still just a story to us. We didn't experience it. We read about it, try to imagine it, both in scale and in scope, right? But here's an interesting question, because we have books, right? We all get to read. We have this division that we see. We have this group of the children of Israel. At that point, at that moment, only some of them were actually involved in the exodus from Egypt. Only those oldies, Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, were actually there in the mix. But these three people alive who were there, they are only ones who have the full awareness of it. I mean, if this were World War II, you would say that they were on Normandy Beach. We have movies like Band of Brothers, right? These people, they're only aware of the stories that they've been told. They don't have a picture to go back and look at and see. They don't have a movie that they can pull up and play on their pads or iPhones or televisions. They don't have a book that they can pick up. They don't have ruins that they could look at. They only have a story that's being told to them. And I think this is why the scroll of Deuteronomy is so essential. It's their reminder. It's an account of the story to ensure that Moses prepares this group of grown-up children now, and he reminds them of the vows of their forefathers, and the commitment that they will now need to make, because they need to add that accountability for themselves. So this will make this look in the scroll of Deuteronomy so fun and yet so vital, right? Because the purpose of this story is different from that of the scrolls before it, which is why we get the Genesis chapter 2 deja vu feel right here. I think this is going to be a fun journey. We have no excuse not to be aware of the pitfalls that are here. Why? We get it twice. I'm looking forward to our next Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet.